But otherwise, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, evening, nights, wherever in the world that you are. In the interim, while we're waiting for a few other people to join in, if anybody does feel brave enough to start the conversation, very happy to start taking a couple of introductions. I don't think we're a very big group tonight. I think there's around 12 people joining us. So it'd be nice to get to know each of you a little bit. So if anyone wants to kick off the conversation, raise your hand, use the little hand icon thing, and tell us who you are, where in the world you are, and what interested you in this conversation. Very happy to let you jump in whenever you feel comfortable. Any volunteers? Tom.
Yeah.
Old-fashioned hand works.
Yes. So I'm Tom. I'm from London, the UK. I'm an accountant, and I'm just very interested in the whole kind of concept of decision making, especially when you don't have enough information to sort of, to be sure about things. So it's also kind of interesting to find a different perspective on that.
And instead of asking you what you do, what are you interested in general in this life of ours? What is the one question that keeps you up at night or gets you up in the morning, which is probably more important?
Why? I don't know. I haven't got an answer for that, I'm afraid. Sorry.
That's fine.
I'll think of one. I'll think of one.
Maybe this book and this conversation gives you that raison d'etre, etc. Otherwise, for those of you who don't know who I am, I'm not really important to this other than sort of facilitating the conversation, moving it along. My name is Bronwyn. I'm based in Johannesburg, South Africa, which is an interesting place to be at this particular time in the world, although there are other interesting places to be at this particular time too. And my day job is actually, I'm a futurist. So I'm a futurist and an economist, as I like to joke. I'm a trained economist and we train to predict the future in that field. But as a futurist, we don't do that at all. We talk about what could happen, what should happen, go entirely off forecast. So I have a little bit of forecast, a little bit of foresight in my background. And the Interintellect likes to use me for these conversations that lean into the fringes of kind of economic and financial thinking, that take those principles beyond mere markets towards what matters for human beings. I think we've waited long enough. So let's get started officially. Enough from me. As I said, I'm Bronwyn. I would like to introduce you to Peter, our guest of honor, but I'm not actually even going to do that. So I'm going to make him introduce himself and why he wrote the book that he wrote that is bringing us all together today, tonight, this afternoon, this evening, wherever we are again. Peter, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Bronwyn. I'm Peter Atwater. I spend my day studying the way we feel and its impact on the choices we make. And specifically, my focus is confidence, which is a word that I think we too often think of in the same way we think of the word pornography, and that we know it when we see it, but we don't spend very much time thinking exactly about what we mean when we use the word confidence. And I've spent about a decade trying to figure out what that word means. And in my work, I've sort of boiled it down to two variables. One is the world of predictability, that is how we feel things are in terms of their certainty ahead. And the second piece of it is our sense of control and how capable or prepared we feel in the future we imagine. And I always like to stop at this point to reinforce that anytime we're talking about the future, we're imagining it. We don't predict it, we imagine it. And I think particularly economists, we get in trouble for trying to predict the future, not realizing that our forecasts are too often a reflection of how we feel ourselves. So the book that I've written is really all about how our feelings of certainty and control drive how we think, what we want, what we do, and also the stories we tell ourselves and others. So that's why I wrote the book.
Excellent. And the book itself, I don't think anyone could have read it yet because it's still, when is it actually officially being launched? Let's start with that question before I jump in with my comments.
Yeah, so it was supposed to be August 1st, but here in the United States, there's supposed to be a strike by the UPS workers that begins August 1st. So the book will now be available on July 25th. So they've moved up the launch date. So,
Oh, okay. Well, I did have the privilege of having a preview of reading it. And my very first thought on reading it is that the book itself is essentially, it's structured around the matrix that you've used to frame that exact thought that you've articulated there. That confidence comes down to, as you said, the certainty on the one axis and then your control level on the other side of that. And into that, of course, you unpack in a lot more greater detail. As I mentioned, my background is both in economics and feature studies on the academic side of things has an interesting model that's very similar to yours or kind of fits into it. I don't know if you've heard of the Pollock game, which also is a 2x2 matrix that looks at what they term to be agency rather than certainty like you have there. So on the certainty axis, they would have agency. And then for the other axis, it could almost be a sort of a turn your grid into like a 3D cube, because where they look at there is optimism versus pessimism. Things are good and getting better and things are bad and getting worse, which is not quite the same as your sort of certainty or certainty factor there. But I thought it was very interesting how it sort of maps on, and a lot of the conversation starters that come from playing the Pollock game map neatly onto yours, but you then take it that step further into articulating kind of what you can do about it, which is where the Pollock game tends to kind of fall apart. So I wanted to get your thoughts if you've actually ever come across that, or if you do see how it could slot together with your work, and then we can obviously go further down the detail of where you're coming from.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with it, but I'm not surprised that others have tried to isolate these different variables. Because they are such a critical aspect of our personality and therefore what we do. I don't think we're ever entirely rational or irrational. I think our choices are rationalized, and in the work that I've done, it seems to be a function of our location on that quadrant, that we're different people in each of those boxes. And I've labeled the boxes because I think they have personalities that go along with them. And I think those personalities are really important. So if you don't mind, I thought it might make some sense to actually to talk about them in their own right, just to help frame the conversation today.
Absolutely. I think it's such a visual idea. If you want to share your screen, by all means, go ahead and do that. It's easier to talk around these things once you've got a model for the thought.
Yep. Did it in the wrong sequence. You'd think after years of teaching in Zoom, I would be easier with this. So if we think about how we feel, each of these boxes is a different feeling, series of actions, preferences, etc. Upper right-hand corner, where we have certainty and control, I call that our comfort zone. That's where things feel easy to us. We feel like we know what's coming. We feel prepared for it. Time flies when we're in this box. This tends to be where we attribute most of the success in life. And I'm a big believer that we don't need confidence to be successful, but that confidence is a consequence of being successful. It's the experience that puts us in that upper right-hand corner. The second box that I'll talk about is the one in the lower left-hand corner. And this is the stress center. Anytime where we don't have certainty or control in our lives, we feel anxious, we feel things are unpredictable, we don't know what's going to happen next. And this is where we're impatient, where time moves slowly. If I think about the traumatic events in our lives, no matter the cause, they all tend to put us down here in this lower left-hand corner. And so whether we've been mugged or we've broken a bone or we end up in the emergency room, the experiences that create feelings of uncertainty and powerlessness are in that lower left-hand corner. And it's helpful to then think about this, when we think about confidence, its opposite, its antonym is vulnerability. That when I'm not confident, I feel somehow exposed to what's happening around me. And so I like to think of confidence as being a slider switch, where the more confident we are, the less vulnerable we feel. the less confident we are, the more vulnerable we feel. There are a lot of statements that when we lack confidence, that lacking confidence is an experience. It's like, no, it's not that we lack confidence, it's that we feel vulnerable. And so it's that vulnerability that results in the highly impulsive and emotional behavior that we tend to exhibit down here in this lower left-hand corner. The other two boxes, we don't spend much time thinking about, and in many ways, we don't think of them as existing at all. And yet, most of our lives are spent in one of those two boxes. The lower right-hand corner, environments of high certainty and low control, I think of those as the passenger seat. Whether we're on an airplane, in the car with someone else has the wheel. These are also environments of authoritarianism, where you have a dominant leader in government and in the office, in your life, and you feel a sense of powerlessness. It's also a roller coaster. And as a result, our feelings in that box are sometimes very favorable, sometimes very frightening. And there's not a consistent experience, but there's a fragility to the environment where we can quickly go from being on an airplane thinking life is great to turbulence where suddenly we feel like we're in the stress center. And then the last box is the upper left-hand box. I think of this as the launch pad. These are environments where we've taken control, but we don't know the outcome of our actions. It's when you've pulled the lever on a slot machine, or you're investing. I mean, all of our financial decisions, borrowing, lending, investing, all happen in that upper left-hand box. And then we don't know what the outcome is until the outcome arrives some point in the future. What's so interesting about this box is that our decisions tend to be entirely a function of where we think we're going to land. If I think I'm going to land in the comfort zone, I'm going to make one series of choices in the launch pad. On the other hand, if I'm afraid I'm going to end up in the stress center, I'm going to make a whole different series. And so, like the passenger seat, we can be one of two personalities, but the environment, again, is inherently fragile. There's something missing in the decision, in that environment where we're making a decision. And I figure this is probably a good place to pause and invite questions and comments and observations.
Yeah, please go ahead. Again, raise your physical hand or the little icon, and we'll get to you as soon as we can. So I'm sure you all came here because you had questions or because you had thoughts around this topic. So please do use the opportunity to engage. These are much more fun when we've got banter and not just a one-way conversation. Very quiet.
So, if I talk to self-help experts, there tends to be a mindset that once you regain confidence, you will always be confident. And the reality is that our lives move us around these four boxes frequently. There's no there's no stasis to our lives. 1 minute you're feeling good on an airplane, the next minute there's turbulence. Real life moves us around. COVID, moved us from the upper right-hand corner dramatically and suddenly into the lower left-hand box. The panic that we experienced was essentially telling us we were moving quickly into the lower left-hand corner. And so we can watch as events unfold and have a very good sense of what people are likely to do based on where they are. In the past 24 hours, we've watched this event unfold in the former Soviet Union, in Russia. And you can watch, whether it's on Twitter or through social media more broadly, a completely different change in focus and energy as the coup attempt was unfolded. Tom.
So I was going to work out how to unmute myself. I mean, I think that what was interesting about that was the especially talking about the recent events in Russia. There's a kind of one other thing that always it's not the question that gets me up in the morning, but it's the thing that I kind of think about a lot is that people's certainty about stuff or people's confidence in a particular prediction or whatever isn't always a very accurate one. So you had especially with the Wagner thing that was a lot of people instantly became experts on sort of Russian military or coups in Russia on Twitter and places and so that sort of fake certainty that they suddenly had, I can see from your thing, it kind of puts them into the the passenger seat or the comfort zone rather than the stress center. If you have to admit you don't know what the hell's going to happen, so
Yeah,
it's kind of more it's more comforting to kind of pretend that you're absolutely positive about what's going to be the next step.
Yeah, and Twitter and financial media are filled with what I call confidence theater, the appearance that you have absolute certainty in what's coming and you're in control of the situation. We have a political environment today that is dominated by the behavioral traits that we associate with extreme confidence, and you see it in professional sports and in business more broadly. This is a time where the appearance of being confident matters more than the accuracy of what you're suggesting is ahead.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's sort of like I kind of call that the CEO disease, but you get, especially with sort of startups and things, people are very will express with absolute certainty what's going to happen next, and and it's it's not certain in any way, shape, or form, but there's a very different sort of. But that's what makes you a CEO, is the ability to express confidence despite the evidence.
Yeah, and we would never tolerate a CEO who didn't know what was coming next. But what's so interesting is if you look at the language CEOs used when COVID hit, they immediately jumped on the word unprecedented because it enabled them to that COVID was something that couldn't be predicted. And so suddenly it was like this get out of jail free card. When things happen that are unexpected, you'll see corporate executives and policymakers for that matter, jump on that. And when they all do it together, it's sort of if we all say it loud enough and frequently enough, then everybody will believe that it was okay that we weren't ready for this. They did the same thing with the financial crisis in 2008.
Yeah, if nobody knows, then nobody has to know. It's a great excuse.
Yeah.
But before we get to Grant, I think it's an important point to make that your matrix to look at there, it's how you as the individual feel about the situation. It's not about the reality of situation or the actual probability of success or failure or whatever outcome you're looking at. It's a sense that it's very personal, it's very subjective, and it's not actually based on rationality at all. It's based on emotion, which I thought was quite interesting because you structured it according to how you feel, how you respond, not what is.
Yeah, and I do a lot of work where I'll hand these out to people in different moments, and you'll see that two people experiencing the same situation may have very different senses of where they are on this. Roller coasters are a great example, where somebody who's terrified of a roller coaster will put the dot in the lower left-hand corner, while others will put it in the upper right-hand corner. The reality is neither is accurate. If you're going to put a dot anywhere, it should be in that lower right-hand corner, and very far to the far right. You have a tremendous amount of certainty getting on a roller coaster today.
Yeah, or a submarine, which is based on current.
I mean, that's a great example of a group of people who thought they had certainty and control
you.
and misled themselves.
Yeah, I definitely thought about your book when listening and watching to how that whole new story unraveled. It was a perfect example of that, how different people responded and reacted.
Yeah.
Grant, over to you.
Yeah, on the subject, when you brought up, what's been happening in Russia the past couple of days, and how many people had knee-jerk reactions with a lot of people with absolute certainty thought they had it of what was going on, and then you saw a lot of people just sitting back and just taking facts in as they come in. And somebody posted late yesterday, probably the best example. They said, this goes to show that sitting back and remaining for more facts to come in remains undefeated. That entire ordeal, because even more and more, ever since when COVID began, when everybody started getting interconnected, it started being a lot more glued to the internet and just taking more and more facts in as it comes in. You got to see a lot more people, having their knee-jerk reactions, trying to jump to a conclusion. But you also saw not an equal amount, but a more ratio of people actually developing more critical thinking skills as things went on and waiting for more facts to come in, giving themselves more control and more certainty, and getting more people into that more comfort zone of the diagram going. But it still over the past couple of days, Russia showed how many people still are in the knee-jerk reaction phase of developing their own conclusions of items.
Yeah, and when we have these moments that seem to have come out of the blue, we will immediately go for the easiest scenario we can think of. If you looked at the timeline from 9/11, first thing in the morning, it was pilot error, it was bad weather, it was all of these things that were quickly discounted. But for moments in time, the crowd went to the easiest, simplest, most shareable rationale that they possibly could. Which is why as a researcher, I love Twitter, because whatever is trending tends to be the simplest, often stupidest. I hate to say that, but just the laziest ideas out there.
Well, that's democracy, right? It's the lowest common denominator that everyone can kind of agree on. So
Yeah.
you're gonna tend towards the middle of that bell curve. Not a great place to be with given AI and everything that's happening, where the middle becomes the anti-competitive space to play in. But that's a different story. Randy, did you have a comment, or were you just giving a thumbs up?
Just a thumbs up, but I'll take a moment to make a comment if you can hear me okay.
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah, so my question is, how do we think about coaching people in, let's say, in a professional context, people that might be earlier in their career or people learning a new skill? How do you think about coaching people through this mental framework to move more quickly into the space where they can feel confident, especially like in a rapidly changing environment, like a new field, for example? How do we help people to rationalize their own uncertainty and understand like when they're moving into that zone of more confidence?
Yeah, so there are a couple of thoughts I have, Randy. One is just simply to help them to realize that real life moves them from box to box, that there is no status quo, that your professional career is going to move you around. And again, I think that we mislead individuals, we miscoach particularly younger employees into thinking that their job is to be here at all times. And what can be done and should be done is to help individuals to become resilient, not confident. I want the people who work for me to be comfortable in all four of these boxes, to realize that every box on this quadrant is something that they will experience routinely. And so what you try to do is to help develop skills that move them to the upper right. And here's where the term certainty and control become very useful and can be very tactical. because, and I've had coaches do this with players. So they'll pull a player to the sidelines, and the question is not framed in, God, you just didn't look confident out there, to what do you need to feel more in control? What do you need to feel more certain in what you're doing? And that forces a level of self-reflection on the part of the individual. It becomes about how they're seeing the world and the vulnerability that they're experiencing. And typically with all of these, there's a scarcity. There's a scarcity of control. There's a scarcity of certainty. And if you can work with someone to identify what that is, it's amazing what you can unlock. And very often it's not what you expect. I had a plant manager who was experiencing a lot of employee turnover. And so she started to ask questions about the certainty and control that her employees felt on the job. And what she discovered was that their problems, the things that were bothering them, that were preoccupying them, were things like a broken taillight on their car, and the fact that they didn't have time to get them fixed. And by not getting it fixed, then they were getting speeding, or they were getting tickets, which meant they then had to go to court, which meant they also had to get childcare. And so they had this cascade of events that were driven by this simple thing that if they could get control of it, life would get better. And so she started to help them, either in giving them time or giving them resources, at work to address them. It was a long-winded answer, Randy.
That works. I had a question for you in terms of that whole sort of thing of like the whole way we sort of framed this is that it's a good idea to go up and to the right to get to the top right corner. But I think in your book, you definitely point to the topic, although you don't belabor it too much, in that that's not necessarily the place that you do want to be all the time. If there's actually the actual goal of the human experience to succeed is to shift around the various corners of the box, because when you do have high confidence in general, you can make bad choices for different reasons for when you have low confidence in general. And that perhaps is one of the bigger perceptions or misperceptions or misconceptions that people need to adjust. At least that was the sort of takeaway that I got from reading the book, that the goal isn't to remain in a constant state of certainty. The goal is to become comfortable with letting go of control in some circumstances, or understanding and operating in the low certainty environments in other circumstances. So it's more about resilience than it is about trying to move to a particular place.
Yeah, I mean, I look at these boxes with a level of indifference. There are things that we do best in the stress center. It forces response. It requires a level of focus that we wouldn't have otherwise. So that yes, it's highly uncertain and feelings of powerless, but you should see the things that we generate in terms of grassroots solutions. At the same time, the comfort zone is not all good. We're lazy in terms of our thinking. We don't scrutinize. We get preoccupied with the future and lose sight of things in the present. So we need to realize that there is no ideal. The ideal to me is being okay with being in all four of them at different moments, and to realize that nothing is permanent here.
Yeah, and then there's also the sort of the more practical reasons for wanting to shift perspective or to shift attitude with regards to confidence, in that we tend to, as you articulate in your book, when you have an excess of confidence, you make overconfident decisions, and that's when winners end up losing. And likewise, we take too little risk if we're too underconfident, right? So to get the sort of balance there, how do you get the balance there? Is it a case of consciously learning, using mental models, whatever your favorite practice is, to shift perspective, to zoom in and out of having too much confidence and too little? Or is it about surrounding yourselves with people who have different natural baselines of confidence, optimism, pessimism, which comes back to that Pollock game I was mentioning, because that seems to be like the third sort of spoke that sort of draws us out into optimists versus pessimists, as opposed to just looking at the certainty question too.
Yeah, I think it's always helpful for us to identify what would overconfidence in our lives look like. What would we be doing? I do this with corporate executives. You know, what naming rights, what stadium naming rights are you gonna have? You know, new headquarters, new planes, you know, big acquisitions, you know, things that you can look at objectively and come up with a long list. I call it the sort of a bingo card of overconfidence. But if you can start to see these things happening, the speed at which you make decisions, suddenly you can say, okay, I'm approaching the upper right-hand corner. Rather than slamming on the gas, which most leaders do, this is when I want to start to pull back and to step on the brakes. On the other hand, I need to be as open to the potential that I could be underconfident as I am to being overconfident. I think underconfidence is a word that doesn't get enough airtime these days, because I think many people today are woefully underconfident. They see less certainty and feel more powerless than objectively they should. And so we need to, again, create a sense of, well, what would I do? Or in more cases, what wouldn't I do when I feel underconfident? So that when we start to behave that way, we will deliberately take more risk. You know, in the midst of COVID, that was the time to, you know, pull up the truck and load it with investments. But to convince people that you should do that was all but impossible. And so you could see this crowd filled with underconfidence. At the same time, right before COVID hit, it was, you know, lathered in extreme confidence. And
yeah, that does make a lot of sense. Tom, you look like you wanted to say something a second ago. Has the moment passed, or?
I think I've got it. I think I still remember. Yeah, no, I mean, it strikes me that I kind of, that overconfidence is or over certainty or kind of false certainty is kind of like really rewarded. You know, if you say something, oh, that'll definitely happen or whatever, that's much more, people have more faith in that, whether or not it becomes, you know, it actually happens. It's being confident in that sense seems to be something that we reward a lot more, whereas I think we should probably reward, you know, uncertainty much more than we do. And I don't know if that's something that you addressed in the book, or?
yeah, so I believe that our stories and our actions and our feelings of confidence go hand in hand. It's a triangular equilibrium of these variables. And what I find is we love leaders who express sort of futuristic certainty when we ourselves are extremely confident. And so if you can take sort of our interest in AI of late, it's not a surprise to me that you're seeing, you know, the resurgence of figures like Elon Musk at the same time, a rebound in things like cryptocurrencies. So we tend to look at that level of certainty in the future in a very positive light when we ourselves, when we, the crowd, feel good. We are terrified of the future when confidence is low. And we will discount those who pretend that it's going to get better at the lows, just like we discount the folks that would seem to have, you know, signs of the end of the world is coming when confidence is high. So I would encourage you, Tom, to listen to the narratives, and because the narratives will change based on where we are in this map.
Do you mean as a society, as a kind of, you know, the in terms of economic confidence or whatever, that's where that reflects where we look, what we look for from political or, you know, business leaders?
Sure, yeah, we do, and,
Yeah,
and from the media.
Yeah.
You know, the media, I think, is a brilliant mirror of how we feel. And when I pick up the newspaper in the morning, it's to see what is the news, how is it being cast, you know, who's in favor, who's out of favor, because all of those things are telling me about how we, the reader or the viewer, feel. You know, I don't believe the media changes our views as much as it mirrors the views that we already had back to us. You know, we choose to watch what we watch or read what we watch or read what we read because of how we feel in that moment.
It's like sort of a great, you know, tabloid editor is someone who knows what his readers think before they do, and sort of and tells them what they want to hear, you know, and that's the sort of, I see that,
And
More than that, like even
like,
more than that, there was that whole like study that like took place, what was it, in like the 50s or 60s on like people's optimism, pessimism bias, where they placed classified advertisements in the back of newspapers, like advertising free money if you called the number. And obviously only like optimists and naive people actually called the number. But what they actually found was that pessimists didn't even see them, or people that didn't consider themselves to be optimists, like that's the actual phrasing, didn't even notice the advertisement. So it's like we have a literal blind spot towards information that doesn't match our preconceived bias. And that was really fascinating to me. Like there was actually, they didn't see it, didn't register to them at all.
Interesting. Yeah.
So one of the other things that I've discovered is, and this is how our feelings translate to our actions, is how our preferences change depending on our level of confidence. And if you can think about an environment where you felt extremely vulnerable and things that were extremely uncertain, what mattered to you then was simply me here now. Yourself, self-interest, the immediate time and physical proximity to where you were and when you were. And what we find is that there's an intense level of focus that goes along with being in that lower left-hand corner in the stress center. And that all of our choices reflect self-interest, close physical geography, and near-term temporal distance. And so we're naturally impatient. Tomorrow feels like next week to us. Seconds pass really slowly. We're naturally more xenophobic. We're more fearful of things that don't feel familiar. And this ties to how we think in those moments where we need things to be simple and concrete and nearby. It's why we, stuff cash in our mattresses during a bank run. We want that physical cash right near us when confidence is low. And we did the same with toilet paper and water and all of these sort of crisis goods. And so I know, based on where you are in this quadrant, what you prefer and what you're likely to do as a result, from political choices to economic choices. At the other end of the extreme, our sense is us everywhere forever. We're socially generous, we're inclusive, we embrace all sorts of diversity. We think people around the world are more similar to us than we do when confidence is low. We have long strategic thinking in terms of what's to come in the future with 10, 20, 50-year time horizons. And this is the environment where we explore, where we go to the moon, or if you're a billionaire these days, we go to space. And so that unlimitlessness that exists at the top of the upper right-hand corner is telling us also how we feel. There's an intense level of abstraction when we're extremely confident. It's why things like cryptocurrencies and NFTs and all of the abstraction from early 2021 so caught my attention, because it was telling us, you know, that the financial crowd was feeling exuberant about the future, a sense of invincibility.
Definitely contagious. Randy.
Yeah, so as I listen to the conversation, I'm struck by two thoughts. The first is that this is an excellent framework to think about emotional regulation. Like, how am I feeling at a certain point in time? Is it a valid feeling based on the facts and circumstances? And also at the same time, maybe a tool to use to also regulate your actions. Like, hey, based on how I'm feeling, am I taking the right actions? Am I being proactive enough to validate that the facts that I'm operating with, or that the behaviors that I'm performing, are the right behaviors? Do you have any thoughts on that kind of balance between like emotional regulation and also kind of, like, I would say almost intentionality and kind of proactive action, and how to rationalize those two here?
Oh yeah, I use it. I can tell you my students have come to use it. So if I stop for a second and think, okay, I'm in the lower left-hand corner today. I'm feeling really stressed. You know, things don't feel like they're in control. I know that my mean voice is going to come out. I'm going to be mean to myself. I'm probably going to be mean to others. I know I'm going to be impatient. You know, I know I'm not going to take the risks that I should take. And so I will stop and say, oh, I need to not do these things and do more of these other things. And I will often find myself doing it when I'm in the upper right-hand corner. I mean, I had a student come into class one day. She's late. She sort of rushes across and she says, "Professor, I'm in the lower left-hand corner this morning. I had a fight with my roommate last night. I overslept this morning, and I have an organic chemistry test this afternoon." And she said, "But I know that this afternoon, after I'm done the test, I will be in the comfort zone, or I won't be there anymore." And so she knew what to be on the watch for, just based on where she was. And I think if we can, take our subjective placement and then go, oh, since I'm feeling like I'm here, I need to be careful with these things and need to be doing more of, taking more risk in the stress center than I might otherwise, and take less risk in the comfort zone than I might otherwise. Did that help answer the question, Randy?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Anyone else? We haven't heard from Faye or David or Veda. You there?
Yes, I have a question for Peter. I'll be very interested to read your book, and thank you for sharing the 2-box diagram. It's very interesting. I find what you said about we're terrified of the future, because I think that is a really live question globally right now for humanity. And I love the reminder to listen to the narratives, because I think that's so true. And as you think in particular, maybe about the narrative around climate change and growing climate impacts, how would you use your framework, or would you use your framework to think about human life and how people will be making decision-making from these boxes in the coming decades, as the nature of certainty itself may change a bit for people, from being more of whatever you want to label it, modernity, progress, to a predominance in some places of extremely chaotic negative impacts? I don't know if that question totally made sense, but it's something I've been thinking about for the last 10 minutes as you've been talking.
Sure. So let me share some thoughts. if I think about our interest in climate change as a concept, climate change is highly abstract. It deals with risks far into the future, and it requires us to be generous in terms of our willingness to change, to experience current discomfort with the potential of a future gain ahead. And that says to me that our desire for climate change is something that is only likely to occur when confidence is very high to begin with, when we think we can tackle something that bold and ambitious. When confidence falls, what history suggests, and we've been through these cycles of aspirational climate change, and then nothing seems to happen. What does happen is, as confidence falls and we recognize that we didn't tackle the problems, our focus moves from protection of the future to remediating the present. How do we fix the things that are broken because we didn't address climate change to begin with? And so I expect that as individuals, it could be on a locale basis, it could be on a national basis, as groups recognize their growing vulnerability, they will then be spurred to action. The action may be remediation efforts. So you could see, walls and dikes and greater movement to, alternative energy, but it's going to be focused on an urgent present need. And you could think of it almost in terms of just watching Europe's response to last summer's energy crisis and the impulsive remediation efforts that were initiated around national food security, national energy security, national manufacturing security. Suddenly the focus was, how do we fix our problems ourselves right here? And in other cases, you may see people doing, sort of forced emigration, where they leave where they are because the consequences of a failure to address climate change forces the physical migration of individuals. And again, we've seen that pattern in history, whether it was the potato famine in Ireland or even our own Great Depression. When things get so bad that we can't stay here, we will leave, and we will often leave en masse. So what I would say, Faye, is that we're going to move away. If confidence remains low, we're going to move away from opportunistic efforts on climate to very pragmatic, the consequences of what we didn't do driving the choices we now make. Does that help answer your question?
Absolutely. That gave me a lot of threads to play with. Thank you so much. One other quick question, if I could, as a recovering economist who's led a lot of that discipline go, but still follow it. And once you have that mindset ingrained in your brain, you really can't let it go. When financial markets and some of the business leaders that you were talking about earlier are the most confident, particularly en masse, is right before things may really go off in a bad way. What might you share with us, any insights around that phenomenon, that when those bubbles of thought take hold, there's often, even hugely negative impacts from that?
Yeah, and sadly, we learn nothing from history. We can't help ourselves but to be drawn into the upper right-hand corner of the comfort zone. I think that the upper right-hand corner and the lower left-hand corner are highly magnetized, that we're pulled in one direction or the other. It's why coming out of a traumatic event is so difficult, is that there's this pull towards powerlessness and uncertainty that we must overcome. But that exists at the high end. It's the mania sensation. And today the manias are happening faster and more broadly than ever before. And so the benefits of playing into those manias are enormous. And so they tend to be steeper, more dramatic. And so, and the crowd is bigger and louder. So to not play in them becomes a very difficult thing. It's hard, particularly if you're connected into social media, to avoid that siren song. And I worry, though, that same speed and volume has the potential to play on the other side. If I look at market history, one of my favorite historical moments was the Panic of 1857. And it was a panic that moved far faster and wider than any panic before it. Prior to that, the panics took months to play out. And you read the history and it says, well, yeah, the difference was the telegraph versus mail. And now we've gone from telegraph to telephone to radio to television to the internet to social media. And so the speed at which and the volume at which the crowd now moves has the potential to dramatically exaggerate the gains at the top and the losses at the bottom. And so I think anyone operating in the financial markets today needs to realize that we move impulsively and emotionally at both ends. And the tools that we have to trade, to talk, to exchange ideas enable us to do it faster and in a bigger crowd than ever.
Yeah, the contagion thing is something to watch and to worry about. I mean, like just looking at the sort of buzzwords of the last couple of years, it's like we haven't got out of our COVID crisis mindset. We're still jumping from thing to thing, particularly in the financial markets, whether it's, as you said, NFTs, or whether it's, now it's AI stocks. How much did the European Parliament or not Parliament, the EU funds just invest in that AI company? How many billions of euros, for a company that was founded not even 4 weeks ago? If that's not a sort of symptom of mimetic herd-like behavior, not based on any sort of coherent reality, or definitely operating out of that top right-hand box, I'm not sure what is.
Yeah, we now have governments around the world behaving like retail investors. And
not just retail investors, behaving like cowboy investors. Yes. Your mom's not going to do that with her money,
Yeah. No, it's wild to watch them in that same FOMO, fear of missing out mindset that we attribute to the crowd. No, has pulled in sovereign wealth funds and fiscal policymakers. They're all wanting to invest in this highly abstract futuristic technology, which, as a researcher tells me, they too are in the upper right-hand corner. I mean, when you look at the fact that LVMH, the luxury goods company, is the most valuable company across Europe, that's telling us something about how those at the very top feel.
It does, and the actual that's not even an insane thing to do. I mean, we know the actual returns of handbags over time outperform pretty much any other asset class, which is quite something. Yeah. Female desire is quite easy to predict.
And you can now invest in them through Rally Road and these other, own a fractional interest in a Birkin bag.
Yeah, Birkin bags and Burgundy wine are solid bets, solid investments. These are things you can taste and touch and wear, and they speak directly to to the human condition. It's something they're sort of beyond the sort of certainty overconfidence matrix. That's just basic human nature. Rich gonna rich, and people gonna want what people want, which is interesting. Which is a point I wanted to discuss with you. How do you separate what choices are based on confidence and what choices are based on underlying factors, and how do we separate those two when we are approaching choices, right? Because it's like that's the whole wisdom thing, like the understanding what you can control and what you can't control, and what you should be certain about and what you shouldn't be certain about. You didn't go into that too much of the book, but how to actually approach choices so that essentially reality fits on the map closer to our emotions. So how do we get our emotions and how we feel about a situation closer to the reality of that situation?
Yeah, so I often will start with the question of, am I making the choice out of a feeling of abundance or a feeling of scarcity? Because behind the scenes, those tend to be the variables that we consider. And importantly, to recognize that scarcity and abundance exist in money, in power, in health, in identity, in education, in more than simply I've got a lot of money, I want to do something. And so when I'm reading the headlines, am I looking at decision-making being made out of feelings of abundance or out of scarcity? And this is a framework that then you can apply in your own life, and looking at the choices you're making to factor in, am I too certain of the abundance that I feel? Am I too certain of the scarcity that I'm experiencing? Am I being overconfident, underconfident in those assessments? And I will often say, if you don't have a balanced view of the outcome, chances are you're being too confident in your choice. If you can't see that it could go either way, then you're imagining too much certainty. Good and bad certainty. And I always think, if you can't come up with an alternative scenario, that failure is telling you that you are too certain of the result, and to pull back, do less of it, be more careful in that choice.
So do kind of the opposite of what you feel. That's the sort of heuristic, that's the shortcut.
Yeah, and it's remarkable when you can step back and say, wow, I'm certain that this is going to happen. And then to say, what are the consequences of it not happening? Or can I take a chance to protect myself? So let me give you an example. When COVID started to take place and the outbreak was unfolding, every week in my class, we would say, if things got better or worse, what are the decisions we should see people starting to make? So if things are getting better, the volume of news stories should drop. We should see people being less worried about the outbreak. We could identify specific things. And if things got worse, well, we might expect that travel would be banned. We would expect schools to close and companies to start to shut down. And so as we approach spring break, my students and I are talking about the upcoming break, and they concluded that they should just pack up their dorm room. And their feeling was, I may be wrong, things could get better, but by packing up my dorm room, I've taken a low-cost decision to protect myself. That the consequences of packing up my dorm room, yeah, my car's full with stuff. But the benefit from that small action was enormous if the things played out the way they thought. And so I like that framework of, okay, if things go this way, what could I do to benefit from it or to protect myself from it versus the other direction? Just being very specific about alternative possible scenarios.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
this is David.
David, go.
Hi, Ron, how are you? It strikes me, especially after Peter's most recent statement, that the difference between the upper right corner and the lower left corner, in a lot of ways, is how I value additional information, and how I might think about sort of a real options approach to thinking about the future. If I'm in the comfort zone, I don't really give additional information much value, and that may be an unwise state of mind, but that's what it sounds like to me. Whereas if I'm in the stress area, the one thing I want is more information, both from a control perspective and a confidence perspective. And I wonder if you'd comment on that, Peter.
Yeah, in both of those corners, we tend to be impulsive and emotional. And so we're not prone to do complex thinking in the first place. And so to just slow down and consider alternatives is an important step. And frequently you'll hear in a crisis that that's stupid and you're slowing things down. In the work that I did with ER docs to try to understand how do they make good decisions in the stress center, because if you think about it, if I'm an ER doc, that stress center is called Tuesday. So their whole process is constant reevaluation, constant input of information. Their goal is to know more about the situation, not less than, and to make decisions that are not irrevocable, that can continue to evolve as conditions warrant. And I think that there's a lot of learning we can gain from that, both in the lower left-hand corner as well as in the upper right-hand corner, to be more open to, well, what are the what ifs that can develop here? And to be, I will often, particularly when I think about the comfort zone, is, what would you do that would be so extreme a reaction that it would generate laughter among your friends? What would feel so out of sync with sentiment that folks would shake their head wondering whether you'd lost your mind? Because that begins to help you to go, okay, the crowd is really woefully too certain of this outcome. I'd be ridiculed if I didn't follow that crowd. And I always think laughter is a good measure of the extreme sentiment among groups, that you'd be asked to see HR if you raised that issue in a meeting.
Is that the same though, being laughed at and being cancelled or lynched? Would you say that, or would you say that laughed at? I'm not sure. So,
well, social media does it. Whether you call it being canceled, but I will often look at where is social media extreme, and the deafeningness of the crowd, and you can see this at particularly significant turning points where to not believe what social media is touting would bring up anxiety sort of at the middle school lunch table again, that you would feel so socially ostracized. And we do it politically, we do it in the financial markets. It wasn't all that long ago where people were predicting the end of the world for the dollar. And it's like, well, no, that's a pretty good indicator that the dollar isn't going to have its demise this week. And so you can use the deafening stridence of social media as a useful indicator. When Time magazine said Hillary Clinton was unstoppable, that to me was a sign that she's about to have the worst 12 months of her life. And we see this with CEOs, and it happens over and over.
That reminds me of the whole wisdom of the crowds book and thesis that was put out, that crowds only have wisdom when everyone in the crowd is making the decision independently, which never happens in the real world. In the real world, crowds make decisions as a block, and that's more like the Terry Pratchett equation, where the sort of IQ is divided by the number of people in the room, kind of a thing. Yes. So it's like, where is this wisdom of the crowds to be found in terms of breaking apart from sort of contagious views of confidence. And how do we do that? What steps can we take? I mean, as you said, like you have to go against the crowd on social media, but then you can also fall into the trap, as I've spoken about on very similar format here with Jim O'Shaughnessy, the trap of being a constant cynic or being a constant sort of contrarian, because that's no less of a logical fallacy or a bias that you can fall into. So if it was so easy to just bet against the market, we'd all be selling at the selling at the top and selling at the bottom. And so it's very easy in principle. It's very hard in practice, as anyone that's tried to deal with market.
Isn't it also true that on social media, people are always talking their own book anyway?
Yeah.
In the sense that they're trying to, they already have a position. Nobody's coming into social media or anything without an existing position. So they want a certain course of events to happen. So you have to take what you hear from everyone with some grain of salt, or in fact several. Because they're trying to influence the outcome. They're not just expressing a view. They're trying to create a reality.
Yeah, there are no agnostics in social media.
Yeah.
No, everybody is, that equilibrium between what they're saying, their actions, and their stories. It is all entirely consistent. But it's useful. And you can use it to just know where people are. And this is what I do routinely in my work, is to look at what social media is suggesting in terms of how do people feel, how extreme is the mood. And to Bronwyn's point, there's opportunity to play with the crowd until the extreme. You can make a lot of money going with the crowd for a while. And so I as a advisor, it's like I don't encourage people to go against the crowd, other than when the crowd is behaving in a way that is incredibly strident. They're extrapolating the trend, that there's words like unstoppable, unending, relentless. There are adjectives that only come out at the extremes in mood, and they're useful. They're telling me where we are as we're approaching the corner.
Could I ask a question that kind of goes a little bit outside of what we're talking about? I think most of what we're talking about is understanding decision making, going into the process of making a decision. And I'm reminded of Bob Rubin, who was one of Clinton's Treasury secretaries, and who was a financial executive for a while. And he was very big on thinking about the uncertainty surrounding any decision situation. And he said something like, I'm paraphrasing, criticizing a decision that went badly reflects a poor understanding of the uncertainty underlying decision making. Does that make sense? And I wonder if you could use your framework for talking about regret, and sometimes decisions made, whatever box you're in, are going to go wrong. How should you think about those decisions?
So most of the decisions that we regret with hindsight tend to be the ones where we had expressed extreme certainty in the outcome, that we were sure of something. And when that outcome didn't play out, then we regret that we made that decision. Crowds do it in a different form in terms of blame, where, again, the outcome didn't play out as expected. And for those who are making decisions in the public arena, they are inevitably going to be judged in history by the outcome of the choice, not the quality of the choice as it was being made. And so I think that a way to be more cognizant of those consequences, you want to be cognizant of, well, what if this doesn't play out as we expect? How big is the downside? or conversely, if I'm exiting, how big was the upside that I've just forgone? And when those start to migrate in different directions, then you need to be aware that your chances are, again, you're making a decision where you are too certain of one of the other outcomes that exists. But this is where understanding your own level of confidence becomes vital before you walk in the room to make the decision. Because I know that if you're in the comfort zone going into a meeting where a major decision is going to be made, you're not going to scrutinize it with the intensity that you would otherwise undertake. You're going to do it bigger in a more dramatic way than you would if you were somewhere lower in the quadrant. And it works in the opposite way. Just recognizing where you are is likely to make a big difference in the accuracy of the decision you're going to make. And it's hard. And particularly in a board meeting or when you're being hounded by analysts, they want you to. I mean, think about if you went into an analyst meeting today, you're the head of a corporation, and you say, we are going to take a very thoughtful approach to AI. Well, if you're the CEO, that may be the prudent thing to do, but you're going to be ridiculed. You're going to be laughed at. And again, as an observer, that laughter is a useful indicator to say the crowd is somewhere in that upper right-hand corner because it doesn't want prudence. It wants people to go hog wild into this intense abstraction. Did that help frame?
Yeah, very well, thank you.
I had one other question with regards to the passenger seat placement. You mentioned in your opening remarks here this evening and also in the book that you associate being in the passenger seat with authoritarianism. Like, you don't go into too much details to whether you see that from a corporate perspective or from a public sector perspective, but I thought that was an interesting point to get into a little bit further tonight, wherever we are again. And that's the first question there I would have to sort of open that up is, do you see authoritarianism as being a result of people or a people's being stuck in the passenger seat, or do you see it kind of the other way around, that people in passenger seat are people that are already in authoritarian situations? So I don't know what your thoughts were there. Like what came first there, and why do you link that one in particular with politics and with political systems, whereas you don't really frame the other three quadrants in terms of that, but that one you made a particular remark, and I wanted to understand why you did that and why you found that important. So that was interesting.
Okay, can you all see the screen with the quadrant on it?
Yep.
So if I'm in the lower left-hand corner, there are 5 natural responses that we have. I call them the 5 Fs. Fight, flight, freeze, follow, and if you'll excuse me, fuck it. We are naturally nihilistic in the lower left-hand corner. Fight and flight move us in this direction, move us towards the launch pad. We're making a decision to run away or to oppose, where we're not sure what the outcome is going to be, but we're taking control of the situation. That's what fight and flight does. We may be frozen in space. The alternative is follow, and follow tends to move us from the stress center to the passenger seat. We're not gaining control, but we believe we're gaining certainty. And the analogy I would use, and sort of the difference is, if you have a burst pipe here in the lower left-hand corner, you can rush to Home Depot, or you can call a plumber. And so when we call a plumber, we're essentially entering into an authoritarian relationship. We don't think about it that way, but it's an arrangement where we've ceded control to someone else. authoritarians don't ever want to move us back to the comfort zone. If I'm an authoritarian, I want you to have extreme certainty, but ideally, feelings of intense powerlessness. The lower right-hand corner of the quadrant is a maximum security prison. You know exactly what's going to happen, but you have no control of the situation. And so this would define the Weinstein Company. You know, Harvey Weinstein, the organization was one where employees had great certainty, but did not have control. And we see this in abusive relationships. We see this in cults. We see this in authoritarian environments. What we overlook is that they're incredibly fragile, that the appearance of absolute control and absolute certainty requires that the organization be here. If it's not, then you have chaos, you have Attica. If you think about what's happening in Russia, it went from an environment where people presumed it was here to suddenly chaos. And this is what always happens. It's like an airplane. One moment there's calm, the next moment when there's turbulence, there's chaos. And so we see this over and over where authoritarian environments move quickly from the far right corner to somewhere in the stress center when that center core of confidence, of certainty and control becomes questioned. And here again, the subjectivity matters. Authoritarians are only as powerful as the beliefs of those who feel disempowered by the authoritarian. And so that's why they have to be so cruel, is to just keep reinforcing that perception of dominance, that dominance theater, as it were.
That learned helplessness. So basically like the entire management consulting industry, right?
Yeah, but let's talk about Russia just one more moment. If we rewind the tape a year ago, we could see the crowd's assessment of the invulnerability of Vladimir Putin measured in the natural gas market. I mean, natural gas prices skyrocketed. And so the crowd believed that he was likely, there was a level of omnipotence and invulnerability that on the other end, Western Europe felt incredibly vulnerable and powerless, and things were intensely uncertain. I believe that the coup that we've just witnessed was predicted by the natural gas market, because I can use that market to assess the crowd's belief in the invulnerability of Vladimir Putin. In fact, in early June, I wrote to my clients and said, we need to be on the watch for behaviors that would reflect, very low confidence in Russia. Political, military, it could take multiple forms. But I wasn't at all surprised to see what we witnessed this weekend, because the natural gas market was saying Putin is very vulnerable. And we can use the stock price for CEOs. We can use the broad indices for political leaders. I mean, Emmanuel Macron, his confidence is perfectly reflected in the CAC 40 today. And so these are things that enable me and us to track what does the crowd think of these individuals and these organizations. That helpful?
Very much so. Anyone else? Who haven't we heard from today? Well, who's got a further question? Anyone interested in that topic of authoritarianism and confidence and how it's linked together, and how hard it is to get agency back once you have ceded it? It's not just a case that the person you've given it to has a greater incentive. It becomes, let's say, that whole sense of learned helplessness. something that we certainly see a lot with younger generations. We do quite a lot of the generational studies sort of research in my company, as much as the rest of the world is seeming that this is like not trendy at the moment to talk about those cohorts. There's some pretty significant breaks in patterns, not just related to ages, but also related to time at the moment. And one of those things we have seen is the sense of learned helplessness and lack of agency, but not just lack of agency, also lack of desire to claim it, which is really interesting because in the past, teenagers wanted to do anything but submit to authority. That was kind of like how the whole term of teenagers came about. Teenagers were invented, essentially, the word to describe the fact that young people weren't listening to authority. And now, like, not even 100 years later, after that invention of these rebellious young people, we've kind of come full circle to the point where young people have the highest propensity in all sorts of studies to want authoritarian control for a sense, as you said, of perceived safety, not necessarily guaranteed safety, but right down to being quite comfortable with having even government surveillance cameras in their own homes. I mean, like, these are things that young people would be like okay with, which is extraordinary given the history of teenagers, as I said, in the past.
Yeah,
Sorry, carry on.
I mean, what we don't realize is that to leave the passenger seat requires that we go to the launch pad, that we swap control for certainty. And so this is a completely different personality requirement. That this is an environment of entrepreneurialism, that's the box they love. And so you have to be comfortable with uncertainty. And if you're been led to believe that you have no power, that you're not good at taking control, and authoritarian leaders are great at, diminishing the occupants of the passenger seat's belief that they could ever be in control. People in the passenger seat believe that the outcome looks like this, that they go to the launch pad and fail. And you have to help them to go, no, if you spend time in this passenger seat, how do you prepare so that you can go from here to here and end up here? It's why groups of women tend to get together when they choose to oppose somebody like a Harvey Weinstein, that they believe that if they go together, the outcome is going to be this, versus the certainty that they feel that if they did it alone, they would end up in the stress center.
And what sort of techniques have you seen to change that? I mean, like you mentioned, like the feminine tendency to do it as a group or to go to the bathroom together or whatever, to confer on a strategy. But what are personal strategies people can use or employ to get out of the passenger seat holding pattern? Because that is something that comes through in your book too. You want to break out of holding patterns that are holding you back and move forward with some sort of agency. So whether you feel like you have confidence or not, how do you get past that to actually move? Because a passenger seat is a sense of like, let everything happen, like not.
So one of the hardest paragraphs in the book to write was the statement that when we are in the passenger seat, short of physical imprisonment, it is our choice to remain there. That we are, we can blame others for putting us there, but at the end of the day, if we stay there, that's on us. And so if you reframe things to, oh, this is on me, isn't it? Then that starts to spark, well, I don't want to be here. And so what can I do to prepare? And I do talk in the book about the steps you can take to prepare, because you need to realize that you're going to have to go through the launch pad to get out. So what are skills you'll need? What are tools you'll need? What are coaches you'll need, or mentors, or people who can teach you, who can empower you to do this yourself? And so this is somebody choosing to go from, being frustrated with the plumber to taking on the burst pipe themselves. And so they're going to need tools. They're going to need skills that they clearly don't have. And rather than seeing that as weakness, just recognizing that, no, this is the preparedness that I'm going to have.
But isn't that so? I think, I mean, in terms of the plumber, you know, I mean, I quite like the idea that all plumbers are Stalinists, and does sort of, you know, my experience of them does kind of flow that through. But you know, when something goes wrong with the, you know, the plumbing, in a sense, you know, getting a plumber in makes perfect sense, because, you know, they could learn how to do all this stuff and buy all the tools and all the rest of it, but that's going to take me a lot longer than phoning a guy who's going to come around and tut and charge me, you know, a fortune. So it's a kind of, there's a sort of rational saying or rational justification for staying in the passenger seat sometimes. It's and similarly with the sort of authoritarian thing. I mean, I was reading about sort of, you know, post-war Eastern Europe, and a lot of people felt that certainty, especially after the war, was something that was worth having, you know, because if you've been sort of bombed and, you know, shifted around, then that certainty has a lot of emotional and you know, value, because, you know, you've seen how bad it can be if you don't know what's going to happen, and even if you know what's going to happen is pretty bad, at least it's not really, really bad, you know. And that's
Exactly. And if I'm in the lower left-hand corner, that's a very rational choice to be, you know, dry and warm.
And there's also, I mean, but you know, you've got your in different areas of your life. Clearly, you can be in different sort of zones. You know, I don't know, in your work, you might feel in the launch pad, whereas in another situation would be different. So there's a kind of, you know, it's a different areas would be in different quadrants, you know. And that's a kind of
we forget that, you know, that the environments of cult leaders, abusive, you know, priests and ministers. I mean, you look at the predators of the world, that lower left-hand corner is their feeding zone. And all they have to do is to promise better, and they will attract followers. And we need to be better at spotting them, and we're terrible.
But not, I mean, I'm kind of defending the authoritarianism, but sometimes, you know, if you could guarantee better, that's not a bad thing. If, you know, you've got a plumber that's going to come and fix the thing, that's fine. If you've got a political leader that's not going to make it into, you know, Eden or the Elysian fields, then still that's okay. You know, I mean, at least they'll fix the plumbing, you know, or whatever. And that's sort of quite often they, you know, we've had I think we're on 8 prime ministers this week or whatever, but in the UK. So we a little certainty would be kind of nice, you know, just to, you know, I mean, even if they were just making it steadily worse, then rather than just, you know, everything.
But you
going
want to
all
come to
over
South Africa? Is that what you want?
Not quite there yet, but you know, at least the weather's better. You know,
slow downhill roll. You know, rolling downhill, not fast.
But I think Tom highlights that, you know, when you have extreme powerlessness and uncertainty, someone providing a message of certainty is likely to draw a massive crowd. And what we forget in that moment is they will never take us to the comfort zone. They will take us to the passenger seat and leave us there. And ultimately, if we want to get back to the comfort zone, we will have to empower ourselves to do that. And the longer we stay in the passenger seat with an authoritarian, the less likely that can happen without major revolution, that you have to topple the regime. And as you know, these regimes can last decades.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a kind of frightening thought that, you know, the worst. I mean, I think about the Brexit vote and all the rest of it, and how that was shaped by people's, you know, people were in that kind of stress zone where they thought they didn't feel in control, and they didn't, you know, didn't know what was going to happen, and that was a sort of, so you did get the predators, if you like, you know, pushing them into the passenger seat. Yeah, absolutely.
Me here now, you know, I don't care about Europe, I care about Britain.
absolutely. And
Very predictable.
it's interesting. Yeah. Very interesting. Is there a sort of a kind of correlation between sort of education and I'm just thinking because there's a book about sort of Brexit when and I can't remember the details, but one of the kind of things that they recognized is that people with higher education were pro-Remain and people without it were pro-Leave. And does that sort of affect the way that people in general approach you know, different quadrants and
So there's some subtlety to that. If we look at the affluent, economically, socially, the more elite, they tend to be better educated.
Yeah.
And so it's a factor in those vulnerabilities that others have that this crowd does not. And, you know, when I was talking about things we feel vulnerable about, education is one of those elements. I would frame it more, and you know, I coined the term the K-shaped recovery as a discussion not on the economics, but of relative confidence. And so what we have today are two populations that are largely decoupled. We have a small population of financially better off, more elite, more abstract thinking versus those that are, you know, seem to be, you know, less capable of abstract thought. They're focused on the absolute in me here now. And they have two very different objectives, two very different preferences. We saw this in 2016 with the popularity of Hillary Clinton. She did better when we felt better. Trump did better when we felt worse. And so you could see this separateness in confidence playing out even well before the pandemic.
yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, that's a new way of looking at the kind of the split, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and if we want to look at something like, you know, the explosion of the Black Lives Matter movement in May of 2020, you could see this stacked vulnerabilities of education, race, economics. You know, all it took was a trigger to see millions of Americans mobilized in the streets. And so that when vulnerabilities are extreme and layered one on top of the other, that's when you get sort of these explosive moments. You get the Arab Spring, you get the riots in South Africa, you get this dramatic sudden movement.
It's also the case that in the case of Brexit, more affluent, more educated people had clearer ties to the continent than perhaps more rural, less educated, less affluent people did. That is more direct ties. You know, when Brexit came into effect, the links to the continent popped up in all sorts of crazy places that surprised a lot of people, I think, in the way it made life more complex. But you know, there was greater clarity, perhaps for more affluent or more educated people, about the nature of the relationship between Britain and the continent than for less affluent people. Yeah, I'm in the U.S., so I may be talking nonsense, but I wonder if that's the case as well.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on the sort of the subset demographics of the two groups, other than their relative confidence. You had, you know, those who were more confident voted for, those who were less confident voted against, or voted for. I got it backwards.
From me looking at the data, from what I remember, the Brexit patterns were quite similar to like the US voting patterns between sort of Democrat and Republican, in that it's largely like Tom sort of mentioned, where it was poorer people, middle class, lower income people voted to leave, and wealthier, more educated people voted to stay. But then there was like that fragment at the end of the highly educated people, like people with PhDs or people in very high income brackets, that then again voted to leave again. Very similar to like the whole Republican split too, like, you know, generally less educated, lower, whatever on scale, but right at the end, there's that little sort of subset that sort of links around the back. I just love that, those sort of anomalies and all sort of political voting data, because it's like a Mobius strip of politics where any extreme argument, there's like this weird linking pattern that links you right through to the entirely opposite view, like at that very, very thin end of the wedge. So very interesting to look at. But again, it all comes down to essentially the different groups acting within their own best interest, or their perceived best interest, given their degree of confidence and certainty about their situations. So try not to take a moral view on these things, more we're all kind of acting amorally when it comes to acting in groups. Again, like crowds act quite differently to individuals. Rainey.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. I think that the pattern that I've observed is that we have this in America, this category called the low information voter that's driven more by emotion. And then in every party and every kind of belief system, there are elites typically as well that are operating more on information. That doesn't mean their information is correct, by the way. So I would point to that, like in your Brexit pattern you mentioned. It doesn't mean that was the I would say the correct, objectively true choice. Exactly. It's just, but it's more driven by their assessment of the information.
Your best interest
exactly. I completely agree with that. I was just comparing that to the American experience, and I think what we saw with some of the different parties and how they assess their choices.
But there's a thing I think in Ezra Klein's book about partisanship and tribalism, and that the more kind of information you had, the more partisan and tribal you were, you know, and so the more you read, the more you kind of it gets much more difficult to sort of be open-minded about stuff, because you're partisan, so you read everything through a certain lens, and there's a very kind of, so your low information voter is less swept up in it in some way.
But with those very public issues, and again, I can say this is kind of an outsider. It's not like I have a dog in any of these sorts of fights. I live on the bottom of Africa. We've got our own problems and our own challenges. We've got no right to poke at other people's business. But what you're saying there in terms of like, the more you read, the more you know, like going down your own sort of reinforcement rabbit holes. But there was also a whole lot of social pressure around these issues, that you were socially expected to vote and support the issues that your communities, the people that you know, the group that you identify with. It was a higher degree than the normal sort of just vote at the polls for your anonymous vote. This was something that was done very publicly, and there was social stigma against, you know, breaking from the group that you belong to. And like, we kind of do know that the UK, even us that don't live there, that there is still like those distinct class lines there. There was almost like a traitorous kind of thing to vote against class lines. And I don't think it's all that different in the US either. Like, also looking at it again from a social media kind of lens, and like observing the continent again from the other side of the world. So you don't have to agree with me, but definitely from where we sit, we certainly see it as being that there are very distinct sort of classes, and you vote with your class, because that's what you identify with. That's what human beings do. We are herd animals. You know, we want to be accepted and liked by a group. We're all sort of overgrown teenagers one way or another. So
there's a real cost to going against it. You know, like,
there's a social cost.
And it was a real sort of shock when you suddenly discovered someone was the wrong side. You know, and it
like,
was,
who's an anti-vaxxer? Like, you can't you not be friends with those people anymore, you know, like it became a social class issue, not just a political issue. And I think that's very difficult for people, for families, for societies over the last few years, in that what was private decisions have now become public decisions, and that you're actually expected to disclose that information. Like, we see this with teenagers on like social media, like they kind of expected to take their clothes off and have their bodies judged because everyone else is doing it. And we sort of like, oh no, you can't do that to the kids. But at the same time, there's a social stigma, not just in voting or not agreeing with your peer group on these highly politicized issues, whether they're vaccines or Brexits or Donald Trump's or whatever the case is. But it's also like, there's also expectation to publicly admit to what your values are. There's like a show me yours and I'll show you mine kind of expectation, which there wasn't even 10 years ago. I think that's what the last sort of like, from the Trump Brexit season till today, that's been an uncomfortable shift So it's like we talk about money, you know, like all these taboo topics that now we're like kind of expected to publicly take a side. You couldn't not take a side, you know, like during COVID, like people were expecting to know your vaccination status. And during Brexit, people were expecting to know your opinion. Even in South Africa, like I'm part of the, unfortunately, the sort of chattering classes, as we call them here, the sort of talking heads and pseudo-intellectual sort of class around here. We're expected to have an opinion, and you're expected to have the right opinion, you know, about these issues that really had nothing to do with us. But that's just an observation. It makes it difficult to go back to what you were saying, Peter, about like when people have very strong sentiments about issues. So it's very hard to act against that.
Yeah, and you know, the vaccine situation is an interesting one because in environments of low confidence, you can see that we put enormous weight on me here now. So a vaccine, we're talking about uncertainty in the future, we're talking about impact on others, and we will be naturally anti-vaccination when confidence is low. That we will not trust the science. Low confidence environments and conspiracy theories go hand in hand. We see this in history over and over and over. And so nobody should have been surprised by the backlash to vaccinations. In fact, they should have been ready for it.
Yeah, I actually had like a very in-depth debate with a self-titled, what did she call herself, a behavioral linguist who was trying to take behavioral economics and to just turn it back into good old propaganda. That's what she did. She was a propagandist. She was employed by the state. And part of her role was to try and convince people in South Africa, which is very low trust against the state, to get the vaccination. But all of her suggestions involved around coercion, threats, judgments, and ridicule, which was exactly the opposite. I'm like, you come from a marketing background. How can you possibly think that threatening and insulting people is going to get them to trust you more? Because the problem is an issue of trust. The problem is not an issue, you know, of like you can't, force wasn't going to work in this case. Like, what are you going to take away from people that don't even have, you know, food to eat for the month? Like, what's going to scare them in that regard? So it was a trust issue. And like, there's sort of sensitivity there. And I think that also comes down to those sort of Brexit and sort of Donald Trump and voting the wrong way, even if it's against your own interests, because you're wanting to stand by your peer group, and it's a resistance as well to being told what to do by people who are wealthier and more educated than you. So it's like, it's a terrible conundrum that we found ourselves in, but I think we approached it in a very sort of paternalistic way. And that sometimes pushing people too hard in the passenger seat, which is kind of my point there, actually means that they're quite happy to jump into the launch pad of their own volition. So like that's the sort of risk that authoritarian policies have. And I certainly saw that in sort of our communities here. Again, it was very clearly marked across sort of class and social strata lines, the sort of choices people were making. But sometimes it backfires.
And there's sometimes the danger of trying to be too clever. That happened in the US early on when there were concerns about a mask shortage. So I think Fauci, made statements to the effect that masks aren't that effective or something like that. Not urging immediate use of masks by everyone because they were wanted to protect the supply for healthcare workers.
Right.
And that became a consistent theme throughout the COVID situation. That they lied to us once.
Right.
They're changing their minds, which was I thought was just fascinating as an example of how political rhetoric can twist anything in a variety of ways.
Oh yeah.
Particularly in the stress center.
Yeah.
In a variety of ways, and also ways that backfire again, ways that end up having then again the opposite results. Like I know you wrote in your book, Peter, about the whole sort of Trump-Hillary thing and how you weren't surprised how the sentiment switched there. But a lot of that was sort of like a perverse incentive or a perverse reaction by sort of a group of people who were sort of, felt sort of by being told we're going to do one thing, kind of wanted to do the other kind of thing. And you got this sort of sense that's sort of the rhetoric actually had the opposite to intended effect.
What other questions can I answer?
Yeah, I mean, officially we over time. So anyone that needs to go, but otherwise happy to continue on as long as you've got something to say or a question to ask. Everyone's thinking now. Can't wait for the book. There's a comment from Randy. Should do it. Right.
Yeah, I kind of think about it over this entire discussion, how in my personal life, in my previous military career, I was given the call sign chaos because I was absolutely very comfortable in making confident decisions in means of chaos. In my late teens, early 20s, actually through my late 20s, I was very unconfident in situations where I still had complete control over everything, but I was always second guessing myself. Now, in my younger years, that's gotten moved to the point of now it's just like if I make a wrong decision in a situation where I have complete control, I just say, well, that didn't work, and then just try something else. But it was for some reason during my career like that, I just was very confident in being in a very chaotic situation. I was always in that upper right-hand corner for some reason. I don't know if it's just how I'm wired, but just in the situations, I'm very confident in the decision I make or was making at the time, even though it was a very critical decision. And any type of wrong decision or backlash to that would, be very grave or severe. But for some reason, I was always very confident in those types of chaotic situations. I don't know if that's just me being weird or in the overall scheme of things, but it's just my personal takeaway of this entire discussion.
There are different personalities. There are people who are really good in the stress center. Emergency room doctors, a lot of first responders, a lot of military individuals. They're not fazed by the extreme uncertainty, and they feel very at home. Interestingly, and I'm please don't imply a connection. And so what we find is that there are individuals who have inherent skills in different boxes. People who are entrepreneurial love the launch pad. They think the comfort zone is boring. There are those pilots who are really comfortable running passenger seat environments, who are very good at providing an authoritarian leadership role. And then you have those in prisons. I mean, you can see this in different degrees, but people who feel better in different boxes. I try to tell my students, if you're going to choose a career where you're comfortable with the box. If you're a chef, and catering to people, and you like serving others, the passenger seat is where you should have your career. On the other hand, if want a career at Home Depot, you're going to be in the launch pad, and it's about empowering people. And so if you're an empowerer, you want to be in that launch pad.
I have a sort of comment there, listening to what you were saying there, Grant, in that there's a difference between what comfort level we have or how happy we are with the degree of certainty and control that we have, and then where we are comfortable making decisions, which is a separate question, I think. Like, we're quite happy to remain in the box where we feel confident. That's fine until we ask to make a decision. Because when you make a decision, either in the launchpad segment or in the comfort zone, actually, if that decision goes bad, it's your fault. Whereas if you make a decision in fact, your decision-making ability is kind of taken away from you in the passenger seat, number one, so your decision's irrelevant. So it's someone else's fault when things go wrong, which is a safe space to make or not make decisions. And then you've got the sort of the low certainty, low control segments. Again, if you make a choice there and it's the wrong one, it's clearly not your fault. You can live with the consequences of your choices because you don't have regret there. There's only regret in the top, right? And I think that a lot of people would rather not have regret and would rather not make the decisions. I think there's another layer there, right? It's not just a case of where you feel comfortable remaining, it's where you feel comfortable actually making choices. And that makes perfect sense, Grant. Like to make a choice under uncertainty is easier than making a choice where you have uncertainty, but you have control, because there you have personal responsibility to yourself if that goes wrong. Like backwards. But those are the decisions that you have to live with.
Yeah, absolutely. It was, if it was a decision that was going to, impact me, impact it very personally, I was, absolutely confident in doing so. And my one commanding officer, General Mulholland at the time, at Special Operations Command South, he said, how confident are you of this? I'm like, pretty confident, sir, about 90%. He's like, good, because of that 10% uncertainty, just know you're going to be the one doing it. Okay. Yes, sir, and march forward. And then it just went from there. So it was that mission between comfort and confidence in the chaotic situations was always it's always just been like my knack, my little forte.
Makes sense.
I had some thoughts about the Q&A earlier about climate change and environmental issues. I think there was a discussion about moving from an attitude promoting prevention and sort of acting in advance to prevent climate change from getting more extreme to a more attitude of mitigation. And I think that's not just a change in boxes. That's also a consequence of not having acted earlier. You at the time, the option was to prevent. The cautionary word was, if you don't prevent, you're going to have to mitigate later. And well, guess what? So now we're having to mitigate. So it's not just a change in attitudes that are leading to different types of responses. It's also the fact that the failure to prevent led to the need to mitigate.
Yeah, and we now feel vulnerable as a result.
And in fact, are vulnerable.
Yeah.
In different ways.
Yep. And part of that is that the risk has gone from feeling abstract in the future unknown to being in the present and being very tangible. I mean, we can measure these things now.
One of those oops situations.
Yeah.
Faye says confidence, the consequence of being successful. Yeah. And so it's increased risk, right? I mean, that was the point, right? The more confident you get, the more risks you take. So it's sort of, it all comes out in the wash. Anyone else? Well, we let Peter go back to getting ready to launch your book 2 weeks early, which must be fun.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to share it, and I hope today's conversation has been helpful to you, not only in understanding what the book will be about, but in understanding what's happening in real time. Because as we watch events unfold, they so often reflect where individuals are in the quadrant. And so we can start to see things that make more sense, that, things that are violent, that are seemingly unexpected, tend to be predictable when you begin to understand where people are as they're making those decisions. So I appreciate you all taking the time today to listen, and if I can be helpful, please please let me know.
Absolutely. If anyone wants to find out more, follow you, get in touch hereafter, what's the best place to find you, Peter? Or is your book going to be available? So where can everyone get a copy of it when, as you said, it's coming out in mid-July? Yeah,
so books are pre-orderable now, thanks to the folks at Amazon and Barnes & Noble and elsewhere. The book will be available on the 25th of July, and there will be an audio book that goes along with it, where there's a PDF with all of the images of the book. The book is very visual, so I probably shouldn't say this, but I recommend the physical book versus the audio book, just because I think the images are such a vital part of understanding what I talk about. And you can find me on Twitter at Peter_Atwater, or on via my website, which is peteratwater.com.
Thank you so much. And to everyone else, thank you for sticking around, and thank you for staying late too. It's been an absolute pleasure, and do look out for the next ones. I know that Anna's got a lot of books and authors coming up. So take a look at the Interintellect homepage and see what you're interested in. Hope to see you around the internet and maybe even in real life somewhere sometime. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you all.